and welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us. The topic of this panel, Media and Entertainment Beyond Borders, will run from 10:45 to 12 noon. For those of you viewing on YouTube live stream, welcome. Please feel free to drop in questions at any time into the chat feature. We will compile them and ask as many as possible to our panelists during the Q&A. The panel leader, Dr. Harjant Gill, will invite each person to speak, after which he'll run a Q&A. And please remember that if you're not speaking, to mute your microphone. Now I'd like to introduce the panel leader, Dr. Harjant Gill from Townsend University, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminal Justice. Welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Vaibhav, for organizing this great conference, and thank you for everyone for joining in virtually. So the title of the panel is Media and Entertainment Beyond Borders. There's some three really exciting presentations that engage with a variety of different medias that engage with South Asian popular culture. So I'll just read I'll just tell you the three panelists in the order in which they will present, and then after that, after they've done their presentations, we'll come back and do the Q&A. So first we have Dr. Tejaswini Ganti, who's an associate professor of anthropology at NYU. Hello, welcome. Then we have Dr. Zinnia Zeiler, I apologize for messing up your name already, assistant professor of South Asia Studies at the University of Helsinki in Finland. And last but not least, we have Dr. Ranjani Mazumdar, who's joining us from New Delhi, professor of cinema studies at JNU. So with that, we'll turn it over to Dr. Ganti, and we'll try to sort of keep it very, if it's okay, we'll keep it informal. So we'll turn it over to Tejaswini and take it away.
All right, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. And I feel like the fact that we are three panelists on three different continents, it really truly exemplifies the nature of the conference. All right, let me just get started. So what do The Jungle Book, Avengers Infinity War, The Lion King, Avengers Endgame, Spider-Man Far From Home, Captain Marvel, and Fast and Furious Hobbs and Shaw all have in common? Aside from the obvious fact of being Hollywood releases, mostly from Disney, these 7 films were among the highest grossing Hindi films in India from 2016 to 2019. Dubbing allows Hollywood studios to broaden their audience base in India, which leads to increased overall revenues from the Indian market. The Vicky Ernst & Young report of 2018 pointed out that the box office collections of Hollywood films comprise 13% of the total theatrical box office in India. While that may not seem like that much, in the past, it was only about 4 to 5%. Of course, these increased numbers means that a lot of the Indian and international press dubbed Hollywood films, characterized dubbed Hollywood films as threats to the Hindi film industry. But however, examining the production process of dubbing reveals a much more complex picture that disrupts simple binaries such as foreign, domestic, or global, local. Based on fieldwork in a dubbing studio in Mumbai in 2016 and 2018, observing the dubbing of Hollywood films into Hindi, as well as interviews with voice artists, scriptwriters, dubbing directors, and local managers of Hollywood studios in India, this presentation challenges nation-bounded understandings of film industries, specifically that of Bollywood and Hollywood. I argue that the political economy and production practices of dubbing in India blurs and makes porous the boundaries between Hollywood and Bollywood, and highlights the instability of categories such as Hollywood, Bollywood, or even Indian cinema. All of the personnel doing the labor, from the scriptwriters to voiceover artists, dubbing directors, and recording engineers, are located in Mumbai and also frequently work in the mainstream Hindi film industry. In fact, the main template for Hindi dubbing is to recast the Hollywood film into the mold of a Bollywood film. The Disney India team in Mumbai who decided to dub The Jungle Book in Hindi spoke at length about their decisions and strategies for the film, as well as their general brief for films they choose to dub. They mentioned that when they brief a writer about adapting a Hollywood film, they tell him that it should be, quote, more like a Hindi film with localized humor, as, quote, the local connect is very important. Hence, their choice of writer is crucial to the localization project, which is why for The Jungle Book, they chose to go with Mayur Puri, an established screenwriter from the Hindi film industry, known for his flair for comedy, rather than a conventional dubbing script writer. Referring to the scripting discussions, one of the managers stated, quote, "We treated it pretty much like a Hindi movie narration. How do we treat Baloo? How do we treat Bagheera? How do we treat Mowgli?" End quote. Another one elaborated upon their efforts at local detailing, such as deciding to render Baloo the bear as a stereotypical Punjabi through his speech and vocal mannerisms. In my fieldwork at a dubbing studio, I noticed that dubbing professionals relied heavily on Hindi cinema and its vast repertoire of films, songs, stars, notable dialogues, and iconic characters to localize Hollywood content. Divya Acharya, a dubbing director at Sound and Vision India, who had supervised the dubbing of Ice Age 5, discussed how older Hindi movies are an important resource for dubbed films. She said, quote, "We go back to our movies and use their songs or dialogues, which are very popular." Discussing Ice Age 5, she mentioned how they used the popular song "Yu Hi Kat Jayega Safar Saath Chalne Se" from the 1993 film Hum Hai Rahi Pyar Ke as a template for a song that in the English version was a camping song. She said, quote, "We had special notes mentioning that the song he's singing is a camping song, so we had to come up with a Hindi song which fit the criteria best. We used this song because it was the closest to the emotion here," end quote. Since they didn't have rights to the actual Hindi film song, they ended up changing the lyrics to avoid any potential future litigation by the film's producers. However, by keeping the same tune, the reference to the original film song was still maintained in the film, thus making it highly relatable. Such an example of mining older Hindi films for material points to the relative freedom that Indian representatives of Hollywood studios have in terms of creative decision-making with respect to dubbing. Another increasingly common practice is to hire Bollywood stars as the lead voices for a dubbing project. And I want to just share my screen here to, all right, 1 second. Here we go. What do you see? Okay. People can see this now, correct? Yeah, so you can see these are all in the last few years, all of the different films that had top Bollywood stars actually do the voices. Just give you a second to read these. So you can see, I mean, over the last, especially over the last 3 years, some really, really kind of A-list stars who are voicing for Hollywood films. All right, I'm gonna stop that again. Oops, sorry. Rather than melding seamlessly into the film, a film star's voice, because of its familiarity, calls attention to the apparatus and artificiality of dubbing, even though dubbing professionals go to great lengths to efface the signs and traces of dubbing. The main impetus to use Hindi film stars is a marketing and promotional one, where the star's presence is foregrounded rather than erased. This is in stark contrast with the prohibitions outlined in voice artist contracts with Hollywood studios against publicizing one's role in voicing for particular animated characters or Hollywood actors. There are numerous promotional videos airing on YouTube where film stars discuss their experiences dubbing for a particular film combined with footage of them in the dubbing studio. The Indian news media also reports heavily on film stars who have voiced for Hollywood films. Therefore, managers of the Indian affiliates of the Hollywood majors attempt to market Hollywood content through Bollywood star-centric frameworks. For them, a Hindi film star adds value in terms of name recognition, publicity, and fan mobilization. Hollywood's success in India is thus dependent upon Bollywood. I'm going to just share my screen again, and so you can see a couple of other images where this is Ranveer Singh promoting Deadpool 2 and the PVR cinemas in Bombay back in 2018. Here's another picture. This was when I was doing field work. So this gives you a sense of like the big marketing push that is done once you have Bollywood stars, voicing for Hollywood films. Oops. The boundaries between Hollywood and Bollywood are blurred further when taking into account the distribution network for dubbed films. The Hindi dubbed Hollywood films are distributed by the same distributors who distribute Bollywood films. In fact, since dubbed films are part of the same distribution and exhibition apparatus as mainstream Bollywood films, the release schedule of dubbed Hollywood films is now calibrated with the release schedule of Bollywood films and vice versa. High-profile Bollywood producers avoid releasing their films on the same date as a heavily anticipated Hollywood film, which we've dubbed into Hindi, and Hollywood studios avoid releasing their high-profile projects opposite a heavily anticipated Bollywood film. Now, as dubbed Hollywood films are part of the same distribution network, their commercial outcome is incorporated into the overall assessments of the health of the Hindi film industry. Since the mid-2000s, territorial distributors have been recovering or profiting from their investment in dubbed Hollywood films, and from 2012 onward, dubbed Hollywood films have been steadily registering as hits within the trade. Sarabjit Singh of Universal Pictures India explained that from the point of view of distributors, Hollywood films were less risky propositions. He said, quote, "If you look at how the films are being negotiated as far as the terms are concerned, then I think Hollywood films are safer because studios like us don't charge a minimum guarantee. We do it on the basis of revenue sharing. There's no risk involved," end quote. While Singh pointed out that most Hollywood films don't earn nearly as much as Bollywood films, he acknowledged that for a distributor or even exhibitor, the distinction between a profitable Bollywood film or a dubbed Hollywood film is irrelevant. As Rajesh Thadani, head of distribution for Pen India Limited, summed up, if it's a Hollywood film or a Bollywood film, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, the distributors are benefiting and the exhibitors are benefiting, end quote. Singh concurred, everyone benefits because money flows into the local system, end quote. The critical role played by Bollywood in the dubbing and circulation of Hollywood films in India disrupts the standard narrative of Hollywood's global hegemony and inverts conventional hierarchies presumed by Euro-American media studies. In fact, the dubbing of Hollywood films into Hindi calls into question the conventional methods of constructing difference along national boundaries and problematizes the very notion of nation-state-bound categories of industry and cinema. For example, how do we categorize the Hindi dub of Disney's The Jungle Book? And one last slide. Here we go. The dubbing script was written by a mainstream Hindi film screenwriter, voiced by popular Bollywood actors, and recorded in a studio in Bombay. With the dubbed Hindi version doing more business than the English original, the question arises, is the Hindi version of The Jungle Book a Hollywood film or a Bollywood film? A focus on dubbing, therefore, highlights the instability of categories such as Hollywood and Bollywood. Rather than dismissing dubbed films as some sort of failure or aberration, the production of dubbed films requires us to expand our conventional categorization of cinema beyond plot, narrative, genre, and faces on screen, and take into consideration factors such as translation, language, dialogue, voice, labor, distribution networks, exhibition infrastructure, and marketing strategies. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Tejaswini. That was a really, really great presentation. I have lots of questions for you. Next, we have Zinea Zeiler. And so I will turn it over to Dr. Zeiler.
Thanks so much. And I'm going to share my screen right from the beginning. Just 1 second. You should be able to see it. Is that correct?
No, we don't see your screen. So
I'm sorry.
Okay, I think we've got it.
Yes, we should have it. We are moving on from films to video games, to then come back to films, as I understand with Ranjani. So I plan to give you a very brief introduction, basically, to what is going on related to video games in India and how the Indian gaming industry is trying to reach out beyond India as well. So now video games today, they are certainly very complex interactive worlds, and they also actively contribute to construct perception of norms, of values, of identities, that is, of society in general. And because of that fact, games become increasingly important in public debate, but also in academic discussions. And one of the things which is highlighted is the global aspect of games and gaming. So currently in India, we find something which I find and it's not only me, it's just the fact, it's a very innovative, in a way even unique development. We have almost a wave of pioneering games which make extensive use of what the game developers whom I spoke to often called an Indian flavor. That is, they implement in video games produced in India something which I, as a researcher, would term Indian cultural heritage. And this includes elements of dance, of dress style, music, colors, a certain aesthetic, and of course also narrative. The history of game production in India is not very old. In fact, we have the first ever game for console, in this case PS2, produced in 2009. That is, India entered that stage of video game production relatively late. And yes, the interesting thing is that right from the beginning, right from this very first more elaborate game, which hit the international markets, we have those Indian elements implemented. Here it's very clear the game is called Hanuman Boy Warrior. It centers quite massively on the storyline, on the narrative of the Ramayana, partly Mahabharata and Puranas and so on. And indeed, this game did put the Indian game development into the global spotlight for a little while, though unfortunately not for the desired reasons. In fact, the game was heavily criticized, mainly for two reasons. One is the technical execution, and the other one is that some groups oppose the implementation of Hindu deities in video game environments. But that was 2009. Since then, a lot of things happened. For instance, just to give you a few numbers, so you have an overview of the scope we are talking about. Between 2010 and 2015, we had market studies which quite correctly predicted a growth rate of 30% for the Indian game industry. And we saw that between 2010 and 2012, that is in 2 years' time, the number of gaming studios, game development studios, exploded from 20, it was 20 in around 2010, to more than 500 studios in 2012, only 2 years later. So, and obviously that meant that the games produced in India became more diversified, and they had a lot more content to offer from that time onwards. For the lack of time, I'm just triggering some examples here which might serve as a base for the discussion later. We might follow up on them if you wish so. One of the games which has been released, produced entirely in India and having success on the global markets, is the game Asura. It was released in 2017, both in its narrative as well in the game aesthetics. It makes, as the name already tells us, it makes quite intensive use of Indian religious narratives, but also aesthetics. Again, you can see some examples for the game aesthetics here. We have that certain fortress style, we have a color code, and so on. This game is called Raji. The full name is Raji, an Ancient Epic. It was released very recently in autumn 2020, and also was quite successful so far on the global markets, not only in India itself. The game, and this is a quote from the website, is a video game set in ancient India. And we have all kinds of heritage elements here. We have classical music traditions. We hear tablas, we hear the ankle bells of the heroine as she walks. We have the dress styles, we have the architectural forms. And this all is not accidental, of course. This is a very conscious decision by the game developers who state, we are working on the game we always wanted to make, a game which reflects lore, myths, stories from our motherland. Just one example of how this is done in this game is the use of what they themselves, the game developers themselves, call mandalas. They play a very specific role in the game itself. So this is a unique kind of selling point, I would almost call that, for a game produced in India. That's yet another game. It isn't out yet, but it is eagerly awaited. It's called Antariksha Sanchar, which has yet another approach. It actually toys a little bit with history. It has the mathematician Srinivasa Ramanujan as one of the main figures, but also it quite intensively uses classical Bharatanatyam style, because it happens to be that the main game developer's mother is Jayalakshmi Eshwar, who is a renowned Bharatanatyam dancer. The game also makes use of, as you can see here, Tamil temple settings, and also something which is called steampunk. And that all is blended into a very specific universe. The last example is something more serious. This is what I would call a serious game. It's the award-winning game Missing, which draws the attention to the abduction of girls in India. So this game speaks about how girls in India are abducted, how they are sold into slavery and prostitution. In the game, you play as such a girl who tries to escape and find its way to freedom again. So games are used for all kinds of purposes beyond entertainment as well. To briefly conclude, so as I said, globally, game developers seek to currently experiment with the potential of video games. In India, we find a reflective and I think very creative turn to the own cultural heritage by game developers, with a declared wish to find a unique point of interest, or as I said before, a selling point for global audiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Zinaya. I will now turn it over to Ranjani, Dr. Ranjani Mazumdar from Delhi. It's probably evening there right now, right? So thank you for staying up and participating in this panel. So we'll take it away. Ranjani, you have to unmute yourself. I think we can't hear you. Sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
The space of the global in the form of foreign locations has been part of Indian cinema since the 1960s. Since the mid-90s, however, the use of international space has increased exponentially following the tremendous success of Yash Chopra's Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, which ushered in a new form of cinema linked to the experiences of transnational families. Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge was shot in many parts of Europe, and travel on the Eurorail was incorporated into the narrative structure. The use of Switzerland's scenic sites played a major role in increasing the influx of Indian tourists to the country. In 2006, the Swiss government felicitated the Dilwale team for its role in promoting tourism. Cinema's affinity with tourism, its ability to transport us to a magical elsewhere, is something that is explicitly incorporated into all the Bombay films that deal with the global. Since the late 1990s, the rise of Eastern Europe as a major location for shooting has been a major development. New networks have developed with organizations dedicated to handling the movement of finance, personnel, labor, and technology. Countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Croatia have all entered the landscape of big-budget spectaculars. Budapest was the location for Sanjay Leela Bhansali's Hum Dil De Chuke Sanam, but it was presented as some Italian city. Kunal Kohli's Fana required Kashmir as a location, which they could not get for security reasons. Poland thus became the site for a simulated Kashmir. When the communists first came to power in the former Soviet bloc, film institutes were set up in several countries to aid in the development of a film culture in support of the socialist cause. Many internationally recognized filmmakers, cinematographers, and other skilled technicians are known to have graduated from these institutions. State support was also extended through the creation of highly equipped studios for production and post-production work. Until 1989, film production and film education were administered and financially managed by the state and by a fairly established distribution and exhibition network that existed within the former Soviet bloc. The fall of the communist regimes in 1989 led to the entry of private capital and a withdrawal of state support from many areas of production. As a result, the infrastructure of film production experienced a serious crisis. The trading of locations for shooting was initiated by many of the EU governments to help in dealing with this economic crisis faced by local film production outfits. India jumped into this fray to exploit the locations of Eastern Europe as well as other untapped West European locations for their productions. The entry of several new European destinations in popular narratives has led to a substantial expansion of the global networks that drive the production of Indian cinema. This expansion, depending on the destination, relies on both corporate structures as well as informal networks. The India International Film Tourism Conclave, or the IIFTC, is an event held in Bombay every year. This is a location pitching event where representatives from European commissions, private production companies, and service providers from across the world congregate to sell the visual attractions of their countries to the Bombay film industry. The event usually has exhibits that showcase catalogs, lush photographs, videos containing particular sequences shot in these countries, and tourist videos. The catalogs provide details of rebates, tax exemptions, and trade agreements. The IIFTC was set up 8 years ago to ease the procedural requirements for Indian filmmaking in European locations. I want to now briefly describe how the pleasure associated with global tourism is incorporated into two different kinds of films. The first is Zoya Akhtar's Zindagi Na Milegi Dobara, a coming-of-age film that deals with male friendship. The second is Manish Sharma's Fan, starring the enormously influential actor Shah Rukh Khan. Okay, now I'm going to share screen. Okay. Zindagi explores the world of three male friends who belong to wealthy families. A substantial part of the film focuses on a holiday in Spain that the three friends embark on. The production team was offered major concessions and support by the Spanish government with a clear eye on the tourism market. Zindagi released in July of 2011, and by September of the same year, tourism from India to Spain rose by 32%. Zindagi followed the structure of a road movie, and after an initial encounter with Barcelona's monumental architecture and its downtown, the three friends embark on a journey using a range of hired cars. The film invites the spectator to navigate the country using automobiles and with their own itinerary. In several sequences, the camera frames the road signs prominently while the friends are peering at maps and planning their own routes. During their automobile journeys, some of the most interesting conversations, songs, and poetry recitations are staged against touristic vistas of expansive fields, dazzling blue skies, horses on the run, and majestic mountains and cliffs. The wind-swept demeanor of the friends as they drive through picturesque locations captured from a variety of camera angles allows spectators the pleasure of a breathtaking encounter with Spain's landscape, which is enhanced through a combination of aerial views shot from a helicopter and ground-level shots taken from moving vehicles. The high-angle views of the sinuous layout of the road with the automobiles making its way against a changing topography of forests, wild grass, the blue sky, and mountains on both sides creates a pleasurable form of navigation for the spectator. The film halts at particular sites that lead to encounters with a range of adventure sports and attractions: scuba diving, skydiving, and the bull run, which is the grand finale of the vacation and the film. The spectator is clearly invited for a touristic encounter with a major European country and combines car travel, walking, flying, and various outdoor sports to introduce Spain's landscape, distinctive architecture, cultural traditions, and its dazzling sun. If Zoya Akhtar worked with a travel narrative and the theme of friendship in Zindagi, Manish Sharma use of Europe in Fan takes a different approach. Shah Rukh Khan plays a double role in the film, one as a superstar and the other as a fan. The film opens with Shah Rukh Khan's original interviews staged at different points in his life, and bit by bit we see how a boy from Delhi became the king of Bollywood. While we have fictional characters on screen, the narrative is clearly drawing on Khan's actual star persona. Fan interrogates the economy of stardom and its pressures by pitting the star and the look-alike fan against each other. The film moves from a lower middle class neighborhood in Delhi to Bombay to London to Dubrovnik in Croatia and back again to Bombay and Delhi. Since the late 1990s, Khan has been viewed as one of India's most successful and bankable male stars abroad. The European segment of the film highlights some of these elements. The entry into London halfway through the film is shot using high angle drone shots of the city as the camera glides over the River Thames, traveling across to show London's landmarks, the Tower Bridge, the business district, well-known buildings like the St. Paul's Cathedral and Trafalgar Square. This combination of postmodern and historical architecture is evocative of London's aerial views and highlights its place as a major financial and tourist center. On the soundtrack, we hear a radio program on Bollywood, with the commentator referring to the star's London show sponsored by Hyundai. We also hear that London is the star's favorite city. In the sequence, the excessive force of stardom is showcased via events, endorsements, performances, electronic billboards, and wax museums. This combination of global space, sponsored entertainment, and a jet set life is meant to introduce the audience to the infrastructure of Khan's transnational superstardom. It is this entrenched, ubiquitous, and powerful network that begins to crack when the fan, now a shadow stalker, starts to eat away at the polished surface. He uses his resemblance to discredit the star with his brash, violent, and unlawful behavior in public. The battle between the two personas is heightened in a cat and mouse chase in which we travel to Dubrovnik in Croatia. Dubrovnik was selected after the director Manish Sharma visited 10 cities to search for an ideal location for a foot chase. In the film, the chase is shot both at ground level and over the old town's iconic rooftops. Has become a popular tourist destination since the HBO series Game of Thrones. The city is usually a popular location for period films, largely due to the well-preserved iconic space of the old town, which has a defensive stone wall surrounding it. The chase is structured in fan to ensure navigation of the old town, its stone walls, archways, covered streets, and a range of Gothic buildings. Unlike Zindagi's leisurely travel, here it is speedy action through which we navigate the old city's architectural form. The mobilization of the global has continued to play an important role in Hindi cinema, something that has been halted abruptly by the pandemic as the world faces a major economic crisis. Whatever the future, the increased presence of the global is now firmly lodged in Bombay's cinematic archive in its early experience with globalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranjani, and thank you so much. And we will open it up to questions in just 1 minute. What I was thinking, these are all really interesting articles, And I was thinking maybe I can begin with some questions of my own, and then we can open it up, take the questions from the audience. And at any point, if you'd like to ask, the panelists would like to ask questions of each other. I know that this is not a traditional panel, and usually in a traditional panel, you get to sit next to each other and sort of talk to people. So if at any point folks want to have a dialogue with each other, please, I welcome that. So let me begin. Well, since Ranjani just presented a really fascinating article, let me begin with Ranjani. I was thinking about Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge and how the kind of transnational location or the diaspora is depicted in it, and in my research, I look at regional Punjabi cinema, and a lot of the films that are set abroad are ones made by one particular director named Manmohan Singh, who actually coincidentally was also the cinematographer on Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge. And it's quite fascinating is that a movie like Mitti Wajah Maar Di, which is a Punjabi film that's Manmohan Singh's very popular film, the opening shots are very similar to Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, but they're not of London. I mean, because it's actually set in California, but they're not of San Francisco, the kind of equivalent of the London equivalent of this major city, cosmopolitan city in California. They're of Yuba City, right? So the location is not necessarily the sort of the cosmopolitan location, it's more the kind of diasporic location. And that's something that you see, I mean, in regional cinema, is that that location shifts a little bit. A lot of the kind of images that you see in Manmohan Singh's film are of of Yuba City, or kind of more suburban areas with big Punjabi populations, as opposed to, Istanbul or London, or even, Zurich, so major cities. So I was thinking if you could talk, maybe if you had a sense of how these kind of, in some ways, these locations might shift according to kind of maybe regional perspectives, maybe in regional cinemas. And also, to what degree, I remember this one time I went and saw a Punjabi film with one of my interlocutors in Chandigarh. And, it was a terrible film. And I thought, I asked him, what did you think of it? And he said, it was a bad film, but, Valeti Sair Karli, which means that, we had a chance to take a little trip abroad, so to think about these films as kind of a travel video of some sort, So if you can talk maybe a little bit about, how the directors maybe think about these particular films as kind of a way to kind of give people two in one. You get a film as well as you get a travel abroad video. You get to kind of do a tour of Istanbul, or some exotic city or European city. So let me just go ahead and ask these questions, and maybe we can answer them together. The Zenea, I was really I'm really fascinated by your research, because I'm also doing work on virtual reality, and now there's increasingly games in India that are coming up that are using virtual reality. And I was really struck by your choice of calling it Indian elements in your presentation, whereas what I see this as very coded kind of Hindu elements of Indianness that are being prefaced within these films, such as Hanuman and Asura. And even, recently, just last year, I was passing through Delhi airport, and they had these sort of game exhibition there. And it was, you put on these VR goggles, and then, you can be Arjun and you can fight the bad guys. And it's often like you're fighting some like Muslim warrior, you're fighting Aurangzeb or something. So I see this as a very, the video game industry and the kind of video games that are coming out of India, as well as animation, really sort of coded ways of kind of, and I don't know if it's intentional or not, and maybe this is just what's popular, a coded way of promoting a particular kind of Hindu identity, Indian identity, that's not necessarily inclusive of other religious communities. So if you could talk a little bit about that choice of the word of using Indian as opposed to Hindu. And then Tejaswini, I really enjoyed your paper, and I was actually reading the paper. You didn't bring it up in your talk. I remember watching Jurassic Park dubbed in Hindi in Chandigarh when I was growing up. And I think we watched it like 10 or 15 times because we were obsessed with dinosaurs at that time. And, you know, what I was thinking was, even back in the 1990s when I was growing up in Chandigarh, and over the years that I've gone back, you know, Chandigarh is a kind of different city because it's sort of a modern, cosmopolitan, upper middle class city. And there's a kind of a stigma against going and watching films that are dubbed in Hindi, as opposed to watching films that actually have subtitles, right? And so just for example, the last film that I watched last English film that I remember watching in screens was in Chandigarh was 12 Years as a Slave, right? That film that came out. And I can't imagine watching a dubbed version of it. And I remember asking, you know, my neighbor who had gone and seen the film, and he said, you know, why would you ever watch a dubbed version? It's so low class, right? So there's a particular kind of class that's associated with, or this kind of class consumption that's associated with watching dubbed films as opposed to films that are subtitled, and being able to sort of say, oh, I'm watching this in subtitle, you know, because I can actually understand English. And I'm really curious to ask that question about, and I don't know if you have the answer to that question, how the choices are made in terms of what cinemas are going to release and where they're going to release it in English with subtitle, and that's also interesting, is that because whenever an English film is shown in India, there are always English subtitles underneath it, you know, so it's English with closed captions essentially, as opposed to with as dubbed. So how are those two different choices that are made, you know, and so if you talk a little bit about that, I'd be really interested to hear that. So so why don't we take it from Ranjani, and then, you know, we'll give Tejaswini a bit of a time to think about her answers.
Yeah. Thanks very much for your comments. And I think that point about regional cinema is really very interesting, because obviously there are other kinds of networks at work, and the connection with diasporic sites in California, for instance, in the film that you mentioned. I would love to see that film. But in the kind of more mainstream Bombay film, because there's a lot of money involved in the trading of locations, and governments are involved in the transactions, it tends to be, you know, let's make it big so that we can bring the audiences to the theaters. And you know, I have always believed that cinema is more a spatial art than a narrative art. So I've always felt that cinema speaks to us through the kind of spatial imagination that it constructs for its audience. And that's why it's really ultimately about cinema as a kind of cartographic form, in which, imagine what it's going to be like when historically we look back at this time. 2 decades, we've seen a lot of Indian films, Bombay films, I shouldn't say Indian films, Bombay films, where the major location is Europe or the US or parts of Asia. You know, you have that as your space, and but they are Indian films, films about Indian characters, and this is going now because the situation has changed in India. One, it's the pandemic, and second is the rise of the heartland, the small town, the heartland. This was the kind of refrain that we got in the industry, that the global space is over, though it's not really quite over. It wasn't quite over till before the pandemic. I don't know what will happen now, but that it's over because now audiences have changed. They want to see the heartland. So the region that you're talking about is something that everyone is really taking seriously in the industry. So various state governments now are offering rebates so that the film industry stops going to the West and shoots in those locations. So it's a kind of different journey that is going on. It's something that I want to follow up on in the future. I don't know whether that answers your question, but and so the video, the travel video, is very much part of this form. If you take cinema as a spatial art, it's intrinsic to the structure of storytelling.
So Zinnia, if you want to take it.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks. So basically, your question in a nutshell was, why do I call it Indian and not Hindu? And if I break it down to that, that's super simple to answer because that's in a way an emic term. That's how the game developers whom I interviewed, and I interviewed a lot of them, called it themselves, which is why I choose to do it here. I have been speaking about specific Hindu elements in video games produced in India on other occasions. And it's true that if I, as a researcher, would choose for a more precise terminology, a lot of it, yes, is informed by Hindu narratives and by Hindu dress style, color codes, and whatever, music traditions, and so on. Interestingly, I think while video game development, of course, aims at making money, at earning money, as much as the film industry is from the producer's side. Here we have the case, and what I spoke about today, that it is especially the so-called indie, that is independent game studios, which come up with these new developments, with this new kind of implementation of, let's keep their term, Indian cultural heritage. So it is not as, how to say that, as pronounced. The aspect of money making is not as pronounced as with the giant big companies. And again, that goes for video game production as well as for film production or TV productions for that matter. So here we have a more reflective understanding of course, we have to earn a living and we want to have a unique selling point, but also a kind of a awareness that games produced in India are not yet on the global landscape. And it's a kind of pride a lot of the game developers take to, yes, distribute a kind of what they perceive as their own background and cultural settings they live in and they have been brought up in. And we were speaking about the diaspora, and that beautifully connects to what Ranjani, you were talking about. It dawned on me while you talked that obviously it's always about the target audiences, not surprisingly. So the films which are produced, which are set entirely in New York, and talking about Bollywood films now in New York or wherever, and your beautiful examples, is exactly the opposite of what my game developers do, who of course target a very different audience, that is people who know basically nothing about India. And they, in a way, have to keep it simple and also, yes, have a kind of adaptation of the more complex Indian cultural world to transmit that as an interesting new way of what happens in games to a global audience. So they have to juggle between that. Of course, they want to have the Indian audience, but especially they also want to reach out to the global audience. This is, I think, is what is happening here. Thanks.
Thanks, Harjan, for your question. I actually have it regarding the stigma or low status of dubbed content. I have an entire article coming out about that. Hopefully, yeah, I think it should be coming out this year. There's an edited collection that it's coming out in. But yeah, I mean, people in the dubbing world were always talking about that very thing, that yes, the people who go. And so one of their efforts is to try to make the dubbed content, in their sense, like make it as like good or if not better than the English content, so then they took great pride, for example, like in a film, the fact that Jungle Book in Hindi made more money in Hindi than it did in English, and that people are saying, oh, everyone said the Hindi version is better, or like the Deadpool series, again, the writers and the people involved with the dubbing said everyone kept saying Deadpool in Hindi was actually funnier than Deadpool, so there's this kind of projects of value creation that I was looking at that's like really fascinating. But the simpler, but back, in terms of like the decisions. So one of the things I was asking all of the Indian executives of the Hollywood studios is like, who makes the decision of what to dub versus subtitle? And by the way, the subtitles of the like English subtitles of just the English films, that's a pretty recent phenomenon. And they decided to do that. They noticed that like someone, in fact, I think it was Universal, they decided to like come up with that because they felt that people weren't understanding the accents, and they realized that once they did that, that was getting them better revenues because people could actually, you know, follow the dialogue. But the decision of what to dub and not dub is taken in India by the Indian executives, right? So it's then completely based on their own. And again, I have this is a different article. I mean, I have a lot of stuff coming out about this like this year. So it's really based on their own kind of ideas of the audience, which not surprisingly are pretty similar to the kinds of ideas that Hindi filmmakers have about audiences, right? So the people at Disney India told me like, well, anything that would win an award, you know, anything that would be considered like, you know, intelligent or, you know, would never be dubbed. Right, because the assumption is that, well, you know, if you can only have managed to watch the film in Hindi, then that must mean like, you know, you're not really into watching anything that's quality. I mean, I listened to that, I was like, wow, this is deja vu. It reminded me of my earlier field work, where basically, you know, film producers are just saying like, well, you know, most audiences are kind of dumb. You know, so that same audience imaginary where it's like, you know, if you only have access to Hindi, then somehow you must not be interested in anything more complicated than like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? They would say, so they would make, and so most films don't get dubbed actually, about 40%, you know, so like Universal and Warner Brothers, they only dub about like, you know, if they release about 15 films a year in India, they dub probably like 3 to 4 films, whereas Disney dubs more, right? So those decisions are made in India, and it is very much predicated on their ideas of like, you know, what people watch. They said that, but at the same time, what's interesting that what undercuts that narrative a little bit, because they're all talking about theatrical release, I discovered that a lot of films that they would say, oh, these films would never get dubbed, have been dubbed, and they're on DVD. So there's a whole other market, which I'm still trying to kind of try to understand, because no one actually could tell me who that market was for. I said, but, so the people at Disney India was like, well, films like Shape of Water, Gravity, The Martian, they wouldn't get dubbed. And I said, but they have been dubbed. I interviewed the voice artist who was, who did the voice in The Martian. And I have those DVDs that I bought in Amazon India, right? So there's this whole other world. So it's like things are getting, a lot more things get dubbed for the DVD market. So the secondary stream, which either they'll go on satellite or they'll be on, DVD. So it's actually quite fascinating. But for theatrical, though, it's a much more limited, because it's a lot of money. And it's not so much the dubbing costs a lot of money, it's the marketing. So as the folks like the guy at Fox told me, he said, once you dub something in Hindi and you want to promote it, so the dubbing cost may only cost, may come up to like 10 lakhs, but to promote a film in Hindi, because then you have to do like satellite and you have to do TV promotions, the marketing costs can go up to something like 7 crores for a film that may cost 10 lakhs to dub. So like there's all of these cost benefit analysis that they end up doing. So
great. I just let me stick with Tejaswini here for 1 minute, because this is a question that I'm going to now switch over to ask questions that folks on YouTube have asked, and some of these answers you've already given in your response to my questions, so I apologize if there are repeats here. But somebody asked about, if these sort of dubbed films, how they affect the revenue model for the Hindi films. And that also got me thinking, if you could talk about that. And also, that also got me thinking about how increasingly now there are Hollywood, American Western companies that are funding and putting a lot of money into Hindi film production, especially, in COVID times where, Amazon Prime and Netflix has become this huge platform, and anybody who has a story to tell, you can, go to them and they'll give you money and you can make your film. Not so easy, but it's so if you could talk a little bit about how the success of the dubbed film English film has affected the revenue model for the Hindi films, and also if you could talk a little bit about the sort of streaming platforms and how things have changed. And I understand that you'll be speculating here because I'm sure you have not been able to get back to, like, we're all sort of in this new world that we're trying to make sense of. So if you could just talk a little bit about that, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. I mean, I think the fact that, like, what I said in my opening in the talk, where you have, like the biggest hit in Hindi in 2019 was Avengers Endgame, right? I mean, that made more money than any kind of, quote, locally produced film. So obviously these big blockbusters, what that does is, of course, it shapes the release, as I said, the release schedule. So like when an Avengers is going to come out, other Hindi filmmakers are like, okay, we don't want our films to be in opposition of that, right? We're not going to release our film. So there's that already is affecting, the kind of landscape of the theatrical distribution. But having said that, when the fact that Avengers Endgame, was the biggest hit in Hindi in 2019, what does that mean? It means, like the way that is being classified by the trade, it means that the distributors of those films, right, made like triple or quadruple their investment, right? So that's what was my last point in the talk, was that obviously, it's Disney, but at the same time, it's also the local. So the local system, like those local distributors and exhibitors, they're still profiting from those films. And in one sense, this is the speculative part. It's like when distributors are getting money into the system, that money also then goes towards, like how do a lot of Hindi films will still get financed through the sale of distribution rights, right? So it's not that those distributors are only buying the Hollywood films to distribute, right? They will also be buying Hindi films. So in that sense, more money comes into the system. If the distributors stay afloat, it's better for everybody involved is one, so that's what I meant about like kind of, if we actually think about the political economy, it really does complicate, these ideas of like, foreign and domestic. At the same time, in terms of the Hollywood, funding Hindi film production, actually, before I get to the streaming platforms, Disney was funding a lot of Hindi, like big budget Hindi films, but then they pulled back and they decided to stop funding. So I think Dangal was their last film that they had actually like put in money, and then they were making such big losses from other films. They said, you know what, we're going to pull out. And so what they would end up doing is then they would end up helping to buy the all India distribution rights, right? Rather than putting in money into production, they were just putting money into distribution, right? And then Fox Star Studios is this joint collaboration, so it does fund Hindi films, right? So like you have, so it will so when it releases its slate, there's Hindi films, but they're also not going to other language films, right? So yeah, so like what do you do with a company like Fox? Is it Indian? Is it American? Whatever, right? So this is like, you have this like transnational media corporation that is funding all kinds of content. When it comes to the streaming platforms, I actually did work, because in the dubbing studio that I was doing field work in, they actually got lots of Netflix content to dub. And I saw House of Cards being, so I saw a lot of, English content being dubbed, but then all the Indian content that was being produced was also getting dubbed in these studios in English for like a wider circulation, right? And so in there, it really is different. There's different ways that something gets greenlit. So something like Sacred Games, which was the first thing, and it was like such a high profile project, that was something that was actually greenlit from Netflix International, which was like LA based. That was not Netflix India. When Sacred Games got greenlit, Netflix India hadn't gotten off the ground yet, right? So those decisions were actually made in Los Angeles. And so there's different ways. Now Netflix India is like really up and running. And so there is that, like how do you, I think they have a lot of autonomy in terms of like what they get to finance. But I think right now the way, there's so many different things going on, but like, I think there's also that what's like, I think going to shape the decisions in the future is all of the political fallout that's happening with, the kind of clampdown on OTT platforms, right, by the government, right? So the fact that like the head of Amazon is like having, police cases registered against her because, people are upset by Thanda, or like, and even Sacred Games when it came out, like people are upset. So I think what I'm curious to see is like the kind of autonomy that the OTT platforms presented as like, here's a space where you have creative autonomy. I remember the Netflix producer who came to Bombay while I was doing field work to oversee the dubbing of Sacred Games in English. And he says, it's Netflix, you can do whatever you want, right? That's not going to happen anymore in India, unfortunately, right? So like, that's what I'm, I'm kind of curious to like follow. But in terms of Netflix's dubbing strategy, I mean, they're the ones I think who are making dubbing more acceptable, legitimate, right? It's like Netflix has gone all out in a global dubbing strategy. And I think part of that is also then helping to change the image of dubbing, right? Because they've learned that within the US, a lot of European web series are actually being watched in their dubbed English form in the US. So even though maybe many of us would be like, oh, we'd rather watch things with subtitles, they're actually, from their data, because they have all this data, they are actually noticing that people would rather watch the dubbed content because it's easy for all kinds of reasons, right? So anyway, so that's just like so many. I think I probably touched on too many other topics, but hopefully that kind of answers.
Yeah, I'm watching Lupin in English. I hate to admit. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions for Zinaya and Ranjani next. So let's go to Zinaya. There's a question about, and this is sort of pigging on the question that I already asked about, themes of Hindu identity, and this is a question about how certain narratives reproduce particular kind of sort of narratives around the minority and majority groups and parties in India, perhaps reinforce them. If you could talk a little bit more specifically about, the significance of a game like Hanuman, or Asura, in the context of kind of the politics of Hindu nationalism, and then the second question I want to ask is about censorship. With film content, as Tejaswini just mentioned, even with Netflix now, there's increasing amount of kind of censorship and overseeing of state in terms of what gets put out and what people are able to see. I'm curious about what is the kind of body that determines what video game is sort of appropriate, and if it meets the kind of standards for dissemination. If you can talk a little bit about that. I have no idea how that works.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Yeah, indeed, the first one goes very much into that direction, which you already picked with your question before. So the thing is, I have to come back to my answer very obviously, because the primary goal of developing such a game is to have this global outreach. It's not that Indian audiences are entirely unimportant, but the actual goal for these games, which I talk about, is international audiences, which means that given the Islamophobic sentiment in a lot of the public debate around the globe, possibly that could be one reason why Muslim culture in India is not really represented in these games. Though then, of course, there are elements. The game Raji, for instance, is set in Rajasthan. And you might also remember the slide which I showed for Asura, where we saw the fortress imagery, which of course reminds of Indo-Muslim architecture. But then it's not a film. It's nothing which is taken from a living example, so to say. There is a lot of fantasy involved, a lot of creativity, and that is demanded and wanted. of course, by the game developers. So I think one of the simple explanations indeed is that around the globe, Indian culture, something as being Indian is perceived as being somehow Hindu influenced. That could be a very simple answer to why these game developers choose to pick specific elements over others. And maybe it's just not time yet. I'm sure we'll see many more developments. I'm looking forward to them. As I said, it's going to diversify more and more. You also mentioned Hanuman, the game Hanuman. Yes, maybe we can take that as an example to a little bit elaborate on that. So I mentioned very briefly in that introduction that in fact, one of the points of critique for the game was by some Hindu groups against implementing Hindu deities in video game environments. But this was 2009. The situation was different then. And very interestingly, it wasn't Hindu groups from India which opposed this move and this game in particular. It was Hindu groups based in the US. So it was Hindu groups in the diaspora. In India, at that point, no one cared about these aspects. They cared about the technicality and found it a bit embarrassing that the first venture of the video game industry from India, produced in India globally, was technically so crappy executed. So that was the critique point from people in India, from people playing games in India. So I think we just have to wait and see what else comes out of India. I don't think that there is a conscious, how to say that, a conscious political idea by the game developers, at least not the ones I spoke to. And again, we might see games which do actually do that. The censorship was another question very quickly on that. So we do have certain rules and regulations around the globe, but the laws are different from nation to nation. In India, to the best of my knowledge, there is nothing which rules or legislates video game content so far.
Interesting. I definitely, just sort of anecdotal observations, I definitely think some of these video games are sort of being pushed as kind of like Hindu national, to make Hindu nationalism cool, or at least they're sort of perceived as that, right? Like there's such a kind of this idea of, BJP and RSS being this sort of fuddy-duddy, not cool, and there is a kind of this sort of attempt to make, I mean, I'm not sure if that's the intention of the video game makers, but certainly the audiences who are buying it and consuming it, part of that is to kind of make Hindu nationalism hip and,
We don't know that. That's a claim, in fact.
Yeah.
we would need to research that, and frankly, I doubt it. I really doubt it, because given the research on reception and on video game content reception by users around the globe actually points to something different. They want a proper technical execution, they want to have fun, they want to have beautiful aesthetics, they want to have like an mesmerizing narrative. These are the things which count.
Great.
Not so much those
Great.
details which you now highlight.
And I'm, as I said, anecdotal observations, so entirely. Ranjani, I have a question here for you, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. I was just sort of thinking back on, I was in Zurich a couple of years ago, and I remember I just went to the train station, and suddenly I had this deja vu. I was like, I've been to this train station, I've seen this train station, I've never been to Zurich, and how come this train station looks so familiar? And then I realized that was a train station that's filmed in Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, the very famous train station, where they're sort of parting ways. And if you could talk a little bit about, and this is the question, it relates to this, is if you could talk how these places, these locations, places like Zurich, how they're affected by their depictions in Bollywood cinema. How does tourism, international global tourism, benefit from, do we see sort of an uptick in tourism to these locations where these films are set? And, and just, just kind of related to that, I was just in Czech Republic a couple of years ago as well with my parents, and I was so surprised to see so many Indians in you know, in the Czech Republic. So I'm just curious to see how these films also promote a particular kind of tourism to particular places. I'm sorry, Ranjani, you have to unmute yourself first. So just.
I would say both yes and no. It does help tourism to some extent, and even with a film like Fan, which has literally only 10 minutes of the film, 10 to 12 minutes of the film is in Dubrovnik in Croatia. But because of Shah Rukh Khan's global position, there are tour operators who take you through the chase sequence over there. And there are articles that have come out now saying that nobody wants to follow, the Indians don't want to go to the Game of Thrones sites. They want to follow Shah Rukh Khan's journey in Fan. So there is a connection like that, you know. So though there are, you know, you've had tour operators who take you through these places. Even for a film like Dawn in Berlin, you have tour operators who take you through these different kinds of sites. So it has played a role. And in Eastern Europe, it has played a role in the recent past because it's cheaper to go to Eastern Europe for holidays. And shooting also is cheaper over there. So there's a kind of conscious transaction that is taking place between the tourism industry, the airline industry, and the film commissions and the line producers, who are the people who actually get the film industry to come to these foreign locations. So it does play a role. And your deja vu moment in Zurich, it happens to a lot of people when they travel to these kinds of places. So we'll have to see how this plays itself out in the future. But it's true that some of these films operate almost like tourism catalogs. They signpost certain kinds of things. I just wanted to respond to something before going back to Zinnia, what she, in her press. I think what she was saying at the end, her response, I would agree with her, because it is true that, you know, there is something about the fantasy of this travel to a notion of India's history that is not always received by everyone as an ideological production, you know. So there are other kinds of elements of affect, pleasure, and journeys and fantasies that come into play. And somehow what has happened because of our current political situation, that those very pleasures that we all grew up with is now being, you know, now being fitted into this kind of structure, which is the most unfortunate thing. But it's true that some of these games have become, I mean, I'm sure there will be games about going into the Taj Mahal and all also, that will also emerge in the coming days, because these are wonders of India that people will want to encounter in other parts of the world. So that's it. I wanted to just respond.
Can I jump in? Harjit, I want to just jump into
very quickly.
Yeah, it's which actually to the tourism thing. I've written about this, which is there's actually there's a phrase called the Bollywood effect, which governments, I mean, the first time it shows up, it's actually in the British Parliament. Australia use it, where it's like tourism, you know, so the Bollywood effect is something, it's referred to as like when tourism arrivals from India increase after, you know, films have shot in a specific place. And that's actually that gets used as a way to like, you know, promote, say like, you know, so give like the kind of film benefits and everything that Ranjini was talking about. So it's an actual phrase, and it's across, like it's in like British tourism, like they talk about the Bollywood effect, like why, you know, and like how to promote, you know, how to promote tourism to, you know, different parts of the world. I mean, to people from the subcontinent is like have film shoot there, and that will, you know, and so people have, and also they've tracked actually Switzerland's tourist arrivals increased, you know, so there's these numbers are there from the point of view of the tourist boards in a variety of, you know, places, including like the US, like Florida opened up a tourist office to in Bombay to try, after Dostana gets shot in Florida, they're like, okay, we want more Bollywood films to shoot in Florida so that we'll have more people. So it's definitely something, it's a very organized effort on the part of tourism boards in different countries, you know. So.
Thank you, Tejaswini. Thank you, Ranjani. Thank you, Zinaya. I just want to thank once again all three of the panelists for such spectacular, interesting, thought-provoking papers, and I can't wait to see and read the eventual sort of as they evolve and you know are disseminated their final you know forms. And I just want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time out today. And I'm going to go ahead and invite Rebecca back onto the screen. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the weekend.